My name is Nicole Grinnan. I'm an archaeologist, maritime archaeologist by training, but increasingly finding myself doing both terrestrial and maritime archaeology in the coastal areas of Florida. I worked with the Florida Public Archaeology Network for about 14 years. The Florida Public Archaeology Network, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a statewide organization that's a program of the University of West Florida that does outreach and education related to Florida's history and archaeology. But as of last week, I've transitioned to a new role at the University of West Florida, which is located in Pensacola, Florida. I'm now the assistant director for the University of West Florida's Archaeology Institute. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a project that we kind of came up with in partnership with the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve and a lot of many partner organizations and agencies in and around the Apalachicola area. So I think, Anita, if you want to go to the next slide, that would be perfect. Excellent. Well, I thought that it would be useful to give you a little bit of background on this project because it's so unique. So we worked with the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve to identify a potential research question. And Anita was a key part of that, and other partners with the reserve, including Megan Lamb. And their ask was that we help them or assist them in the process of understanding their cultural resources in the reserve a little bit better. And for those of you who aren't archaeologists or historians, when I refer to cultural resources, typically what I'm referring to are things like historical sites, archaeological sites, historic structures, historic cemeteries, but other things that are also kind of the intangible aspects of culture as well. So things like traditions and foodways and languages and industries, the ways that people work. So they had a desire to understand or to get a bit more information about these heritage resources in their area, but also how these things are changing over time in relation to natural impacts, things like storms and sea level rise, and then cultural impacts as well, so shifts in industry or development in our coastal areas. So we applied for some funding through the NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve Systems Science Collaborative last year in 2023 to build out this project. And essentially all of the work that's taking place for this project is happening in 2024. And so on this slide here, there's just a brief summary of that, but then also the website for the project as well. And I'll have a slide on that at the end. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide, Anita. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the area that we're talking about, I see some folks more local to Pensacola in the webinar today. The project area is primarily defined by the boundary of the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve. And that's that area highlighted in red here. So if you're in the Pensacola area, we're talking about an area that's east of Pensacola, more towards peninsular Florida, but still very much in the Panhandle. And then if you're in the peninsular Florida, we're talking about an area within the Panhandle that's on your way out to Pensacola to the west. We can go to the next slide, please. So just real quick, and again, for those of you who may not be familiar with the reserve or its boundary, I wanted to highlight some of the unique features of the area. The Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve is a co-managed land unit in the state of Florida. It's a partnership between NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a federal agency, and then a state level agency, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And the reserve was designated in 1979. So it's been a reserve for some time at this point. And if you are interested in visiting and you're not local or you haven't been there yet, they do have a fantastic visitor center and nature center located in East Point, Florida. But the reserve itself is made up of a variety of different kind of components within the Apalachicola area. It includes the lower 52 miles of the Apalachicola River, so south of the Florida border. It also includes most of Apalachicola Bay, along with 2 barrier islands and a third barrier island. So we have St. Vincent Island, Little St. George Island, and a portion of St. George Island. The reserve boundary is one of the largest within the reserve system, which I think I've got this number right, is 32 reserves throughout the United States. But the Apalachicola Reserve includes over 240,000 acres, and most of that acreage is open water. But again, it includes immense estuarine areas. It includes barrier islands, marshes, and uplands as well as you move up the Apalachicola River. The reserve was designated as a UNESCO Biosphere Region in 1983, and these are outstanding areas that have incredible biodiversity with diverse ecosystems. They also, the idea for these biospheres is to foster sustainable economic and human development in the area and to encourage participation of people in these natural spaces. Other unique features about the reserve, and again, I'm just pulling out some simple things or some quick facts for those of you who may not be familiar, but it's a major area for migratory bird species. And the reserve also, I mentioned that a great deal of its acreage includes open water. The reserve supports a large local fishing industry that in previous years employed up to at least 85% of the local population in Franklin County. But the reserve does also stretch into nearby Gulf and Liberty counties as well. So next slide, please, Anita. So I mentioned that the project was funded. It's sponsored by NOAA, their Office for Coastal Management, but they have within that there's a National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative, and that is managed for NOAA by the University of Michigan's Water Center. So all of the work that we're talking about in this presentation, it's all being supported by this very generous grant system. And we can go to the next slide whenever you're ready, Anita. So what are the goals of this project? I kind of gave you an overview about what we wanted to do in terms of understanding or better understanding cultural heritage within the area. But what we wanted to do in particular, because we have had such a strong focus on public outreach and education through the Florida Public Archaeology Network and the University of West Florida, we really wanted to work with the community and to talk to them about how they understand and value and appreciate heritage sites in their area within the Apalachicola area. So again, here's kind of a list of what I'm talking about when I talk about cultural heritage: archaeological sites, cemeteries, structures, other kinds of intangible cultural traditions. But the idea behind the project is in understanding what people value and what they care most about in terms of this cultural heritage, we can help land managers and end users in the Apalachicola area prioritize the work that they do. So if you're familiar with the workings of a municipal, state, or federal agency, you probably know that resources are limited, and resources include both human resources and financial resources. And most of these places don't have cultural resources specialists on staff. Whether it's a historian, an architectural historian, or someone who does strictly archaeology, a lot of times these land management areas don't have these people on staff. So our goal with this project was to not only assist with this understanding of archaeology and local heritage, but also help people working in this area prioritize the work that they do in terms of research or mitigation of impact or interpretation, public interpretation of these resources. So this was kind of the end goal of our project. And in this process, of course, what we're doing is also updating a lot of records for archaeological sites in this area. Florida maintains a database of archaeological sites called the Florida Master Site File. It's not necessarily a public accessible document because the locations of archaeological sites can be sensitive in nature. But a lot of the sites listed on that Florida Master Site File have not been visited by an archaeologist, in some cases in over 50 years. And in the case of the project that we're working on, we had a couple of sites that had not been visited since the 1940s. So part of what we're doing, in addition to all this other stuff, is making sure that the state has the most up-to-date information on the current condition of the archaeological sites as possible. All right, so we can go to the next slide whenever you're ready. So our process for doing what we're doing is kind of threefold. In terms of recording the sites as they are and understanding their current condition, the first thing that we're doing is site monitoring. So we've been doing this since January, and we'll be doing it through July. We've been in the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve for about a week each month over the last 6 months. We're visiting these archaeological sites, cemeteries, and historic structures. We're looking at erosion nearby if there's any, or noting any other impacts to those sites in our monitoring efforts. In terms of engaging the community, a lot of what we're doing focuses around kind of two aspects of engagement. And both of these are kind of collectively referred to as our community conversations. But we have had in January, February, and March, we had 3 community conversation events that we coordinated in partnership with the reserve. Anita did a lot of the on-the-ground work to get people into our community conversation workshop meetings. During those workshops, we asked people about kind of all the things we're talking about here. How do you value archaeology or local cultural heritage? What impacts do you see to what's going on in the Apalachicola area? The other part of this kind of community engagement is an online survey, and I'm going to share a link to that at the end of the presentation. But that online survey is meant to be a way for people in the Apalachicola area to give us information. If they couldn't come in person and talk to us, we still want to hear what they have to say. And then kind of the third aspect of our process is, of course, the reporting part. So that's taking the data that we have, analyzing it, putting it into a summary report, and then sharing it with not only the local land managers, so again, that they can prioritize their work going forward in terms of cultural resources, but also sharing that information with the community as well. And we hope that that will be a way for them to also do some prioritization. What kind of grants do they want to apply for in terms of highlighting local history and heritage? I think that would be incredibly useful in that sense as well. So if you don't mind, the next slide, Anita. So I thought it would be important to introduce kind of the team that's been working with me. In terms of people on the ground, there's of course me. I'm the project lead or the principal investigator for this project that we're working on, but I couldn't do it without the people that I work with in the field. And some of you may be familiar with my colleague Mike Toman. He also works with the Florida Public Archaeology Network as our museum manager. We have a museum here in Pensacola, but I think more importantly and more critical to the project is his role with the Maritime Landscape Alliance for Preservation. So over the last many years, he's been involved with setting up or potentially setting up a national heritage area for the Florida Panhandle, and they're working through that process right now in terms of getting that final designation. But in the act of coming up with a national heritage area and all of the different aspects of it, he has made a lot of contacts and partners on the ground. So he has been an important part of this project as our collaborative lead. And then we also have Bria Brooks. She is a master's student in archaeology here at the University of West Florida. She's also a graduate assistant with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And she has been an incredible person to work with. And part of the reason why she's joined our field team is because she's doing her master's thesis on the Prospect Bluff historic sites and aspects of enslavement and how that is understood in the community today. So if you joined the Sci-Cafe series last month, you probably heard Bria talk about her project. And if you didn't get to join it, Anita can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they're available online, a recording of the previous Sci-Cafes. So I would highly encourage you to check out the work that she's doing.
Yes, I'll put a link in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. And we can go to the next page whenever you're ready. And then the rest of our team, I wanted to highlight, there's the 3 of us on the ground, but this project really is drawing in the skills and the knowledge and the wherewithal of many other people. Important to our work on the ground in Apalachicola, of course, is Anita Grove with the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve, and Megan Lamb, the stewardship coordinator with the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve. We also have Dr. Meredith Martin here at the University of West Florida. She's helping us with our analysis of our community conversation. We've also got Tom Dawson with the University of St. Andrews. This project is the basis for my PhD research with the University of St. Andrews. So he's been especially critical. And then we also have Cassie Kemp, who's with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. She's our data guru. So all of the data that we collect in the field and that we'll eventually share with everyone else, she is in charge of managing that. And then we have Dr. Lindsay Cochran, of course, with East Tennessee State University. She's a professor of anthropology there, and she's helping us with some digital modeling to kind of better provide a graphic visualization of how natural changes could impact the archaeological sites we're looking at over time. So this, of course, is in relation to things like sea level rise. Next slide when you have a chance, Anita. The project incorporates a variety of partners, and these are just a few of the ones that we've been working with in our most recent months. There's the North Florida African American Corridor Project. They provided early support for this work in writing a letter in terms of our grant sponsorship. The Hillside Coalition of Laborers for Apalachicola, or HCOLA, have also been great participants in our community conversations. We've been working with the Research Collaborative with the North American Heritage at Risk Group. And of course, we have the Maritime Landscape Alliance for Preservation, or MLAP. And then, of course, all the other land managers that are within the Apalachicola area. So working with the National Wildlife Refuge System out on St. Vincent Island, with the U.S. Forest Service up at the Prospect Bluff Historic Sites, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission out at the Apalachicola Wildlife and Environmental Area and the Box R Wildlife Management Area, and then Florida State Parks with St. George Island State Park. These are all partners and contributors to this project, and their contributions are incredibly important. Next slide, whenever you have a chance, Anita. So I felt, you know, as an archaeologist, I would be kind of remiss if I didn't have a really brief timeline of the kinds of archaeology we're talking about. And these are going to be the most boring slides, probably, in a sense, before I get to the really beautiful pictures of the work that we're doing in Apalachicola. But just to kind of give you an idea of what kind of history we're talking about, the Apalachicola River Valley has been occupied by humans for over 12,000 years, potentially even older. Some of the oldest recorded sites in the United States are just to the north of the Apalachicola area, and in along sites of freshwater springs, where archaeologists believe that Paleo-Indian people, so when we say Paleo-Indian, we're kind of referring to the kind of the end or the terminus of the last ice age, but these were sources of fresh water, or they were places that brought animals to fresh water, so they would have been a great place for hunting. But most of the archaeology that we're coming into contact with as a part of this project comes from a little bit later time period, and that time period is what archaeologists refer to as the Archaic period. And I think one thing that's important to emphasize is that this is not what these people living in the area would have called themselves. These are names imposed upon them by archaeologists, kind of just to be able to classify different periods of time. What we've been looking at come from the later periods, primarily the Archaic period, the Woodland period, and the Mississippian. So the Archaic period, of course, is when people are starting to develop tools and ceramic technologies here in Florida. And this is a way to adapt to kind of that post-ice age area where estuarine environments like Apalachicola Bay and the Apalachicola River are kind of migrating south and forming. There's a new reliance on smaller animals. The Ice Age period, of course, kind of brings to mind the megafauna that used to live in Florida, critters like mastodons or ground sloths. That, of course, changed by this period when things are getting a little bit warmer. In the Woodland period, we start to see people coming a little bit more sedentary. So they're engaging in hunting and foraging, possibly even starting cultivation of plants a little bit later on. But a lot of the shell midden sites that are incorporated in our project date to this time period, building up higher ground in wetlands areas to make it, better for human occupation, essentially. We also see burial mounds constructed during this period, more elaborate rituals tied to mortuary practices, things like that are starting to happen in this period. But of course, we also have more simple sites like campsites or shell middens where food was simply being processed before it was eaten. In the woodland period, we have a similar kind of thing, burial mounds, shell middens, kind of a continuation or a refinement and a movement toward sedentary life. Anita, if we could go to the next slide when you have a chance. Then we get into the Mississippian period, which is a little bit later on. And some of the, one of the cultures, again, this is a name that archaeologists give it, but we have the Fort Walton culture that was in the woodland period. This is the group that would have been around into the Mississippian period. It was more characterized by larger villages with temple mounds. If you've toured around some of our larger interpreted sites in Northwest Florida, like the one in Fort Walton Beach, you're probably familiar with these kind of temple mounds or temple mound complexes. We call this the Mississippian period because this was part of a broader change in a lot of the cultures within the Mississippi River Valley area, and that kind of extends out into our area of Florida and then down along the coast with some kind of variations in terms of local culture. During this period, again, we see more farmsteads, plant cultivation, use of shell mounds in these coastal and estuarine areas, more complex political systems like that. And then the Mississippian period kind of ends abruptly with the arrival of the Spanish. And so I'm going to do really broad strokes here in terms of, getting into the European period. There's so much history to talk about. But basically, from the arrival of the Spanish, the Fort Walton peoples were encountering European explorers, predominantly the Spanish in the 16th and then in the 17th centuries. Probably the earliest encounters were with the Narvaez and even potentially the De Soto expedition. It's possible they may have been in the area, have spotted Dog Island or St. George Island, but they were certainly nearby. And then into the 17th to the mid-19th century, we get kind of, this whole period is in complete tumult, basically. In terms of, if we're talking about Northwest Florida, and really Florida in general, there's a complete disruption of indigenous culture with the arrival of Europeans. And there is a ton of colonial dispute among the Spanish, the British, and even the French in Northwest Florida as well. And then if we can go to the next slide real quickly, Florida is eventually acquired as a territory by the United States in 1821 with General Andrew Jackson, and that kind of sets off a chain of events that eventually lead to the removal or the displacement of tribal communities among the Creek, the Seminole, the Choctaw, and others in Northwest Florida. It also meant that Florida was now a formal participant in American practices or the American cultural tradition at the time, which would have included enslavement. This was very different from the way the Spanish governed not long before. And it was also around this time that what would eventually become the city of Apalachicola really develops out of the need for the American government to regulate trade and shipping coming down the Apalachicola River out into the Gulf of Mexico and to the rest of the world. So that's my very brief historical overview. Now, if we don't mind going to the next slide, Anita, this is the prettier portion of the presentation. And what I thought I would do is I could talk forever about the work that we've been doing and take you through kind of all of the dirty details of the work. But I thought a good way to capture it would be to kind of walk you in our footsteps during our first week of field work. And this would have been in January. And so I'm going to walk you through how we did our work, the things we ran into, the kinds of sites that we're seeing, and the impacts to those sites that we saw during that first week. So you'll kind of see it in our eyes as it was brand new. At this point in the project, we've seen these sites 2 to 3 times already, but this was really the first time that we were exposed to them. So there's a lot of excitement. So this is just a fantastic view of the area in East Point near where we're staying and in the Apalachicola Reserve housing out there. But if we go to the next slide, I like to, as archaeologists, we talk a big talk about history and time and all of the work that we do, but I thought it would be fun to kind of start with a humbling moment. So here we are. This is our field team. There's myself on the left, Bree in the middle, and Mike on the right. And we are ready to go to one of the first sites that we were going to visit. And we decided to tackle probably the most difficult site to access on this first day. And here we are. We realized that, well, our thought was to traverse through the swamp around the river to the site. And when I looked at it on the map, it wasn't very far. I said, oh, we can walk there. So we weren't going to wear our field boots. So we went to the nearby fishing store in East Point. We bought these shiny, beautiful fishing boots to wear out to the site. And our idea was to kind of walk through the mud to get there. And if we go to the next slide, we can see this is kind of the before picture and then the after picture. Again, a very humbling moment for all of us. We massively underestimated what the terrain was like on our first field visit. So I think we walked maybe 1/10 of a mile before the picture on the left happened. And so Bria, and we all fell victim to this at some point or another, but one of her boots just got completely sucked into the mud. And it took us, I think, maybe 20 to 30 minutes to pull it out. And so we finally got it out. I gave her my my other hiking shoe to wear back to the boat. And we decided we need to come up with another game plan for this site visit. So if we go to the next photo, we go to our next field day. And we decided we needed to take a kayak to the site. We cannot walk overland to where we're going. And so this kind of shows, you know, it's one thing to say we're visiting archaeological sites, but it gives you an idea of how rural and difficult some of these places are to access. And we learned this the hard way during that first field week. But you can see we have a kayak. We eventually got to this initial site by kayak. And if we go to the next photo, you can see that the site that we were visiting is what we commonly refer to as a shell midden. And this is a site you can see on the ground there. One of the interesting things that we're seeing as we look at this particular site is the changes in diet of the people that were living here, probably from, you know, maybe as early as 2000 BC until much later, possibly even into the Mississippian period. But we can see a shift in the environment. So we see a lot of saltwater resources here, including oyster, right, that they were eating. But over time, what we're seeing in other parts of the site are more freshwater or brackish water estuarine species like Rangia clam. And so even just looking at what we're seeing on the ground, we can see environmental change over the course of many thousand years just at this one archaeological site. We can go to the next slide whenever you have a chance, Anita. Here's a close-up of some of, you can see oyster shell. This is a good photo of some of the Rangia clam that we were seeing. So more of a brackish water species. So we believe that this would have happened a little bit later as the river, the Apalachicola River and the estuary started to migrate south. And this particular site started moving away from more dense saltwater areas. Next slide, please. Another photo just showing you some shell. We can go to the next slide. All right, so we get to our next day. So we were all excited because we finally made it out to the site. We didn't get our boots stuck by taking the kayak. And then begins the work on some of the barrier island areas. And some of the first areas that we targeted with the sites that we had selected to monitor as part of the project were on Little St. George Island, which if you live in the area around Apalachicola, you know is only accessible by boat. So here we are on our sturdy research craft supplied by the University of West Florida. We can go to the next slide, Anita. So in accessing the island, we used publicly accessible docks to get where we needed to go, at least in terms of landing on the island. So you can see government dock there in the background. This is the one we've primarily been using, but this is an excellent kind of photograph overview of the terrain on Little St. George Island in the areas, or kind of roughly in the areas of where we were working. Next slide whenever you have a chance, Anita. So it's our long walk out to Little St. George Island. Government dock is quite long. If you've never been out there, it's quite a walk, but it is very beautiful. And there, you can tell that there are a lot of bird species out there, especially where you tie up your boat. There's a lot of, what's a nice way to put it? Bird feces out on that dock that we had to contend with and hauling all of our gear out of the boat. But again, this work was in January, so if you're asking, you know, why are we all bundled up? It's because our temperatures at this time when we were out there were, if we were lucky, we were into the 40s during the day. So it's very different than the field work that we're dealing with right now in terms of June and July. We can go forward whenever you have a chance, Anita. So some of the sites that we're monitoring out there include not only sites of pre-contact peoples, but also later historic period sites. And one of the first ones that we encountered on the island was part of what we believe to be a larger kind of turpentine camp. So if you're familiar with kind of Northwest Florida history, you know that lumber resources are particularly important export for Northwest Florida. And that includes the Apalachicola area. And in tandem with, you know, the felling of trees for lumber, many people also engaged in the turpentining industry. And this is essentially a way to collect the sap from trees to produce pitch and tar for a variety of different purposes, predominantly for caulking and sealing on ships and things like that, because along with the lumber for shipbuilding, there's also the need to waterproof those ships. So a lot of turpentine camps popped up at this time, and the time period I'm talking about is kind of the late 1800s to the early 1900s, before a lot of these forests were kind of harmed irreparably or over harvested. So we're kind of talking about that turn of the 20th century time period. And so here is Bria and I. We've got the tool that we're using is basically a really souped up GPS unit. It's an RTK. This one's called an Aero Gold GNSS RTK. And it gives us a hyper accurate position for our archaeological sites down to a millimeter, or a couple of millimeters in some cases. So that's what we're doing there, is just taking points on some of the things that we're finding at this turpentine campsite. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see some of the artifacts or the material culture that we see in terms of this site. So on the left, we call this a cat face tree. So to collect the sap or the pitch from these trees, essentially the turpentine workers or people engaged in turpentining would cut, they call them cat faces, into the tree. So kind of big slashes in kind of a chevron shape down the length of the tree. And you can see at the bottom there, there's like a little metal piece that's attached to the tree that would have been attached with two small nails essentially, and then a cup would have been there to collect the sap as it came down and was kind of funneled into that cup with that metal sluice. And the cups kind of vary depending on site to site. A lot of people are familiar with the Hurdy cup, which looks a lot like a flower pot with ridges on the outside. They would use things like that to collect the sap. They would also use tin as well. So we see a lot of different kinds of methods for collecting at the site, but I've never seen more cat faces than I have at this particular site on Little St. George Island. They were everywhere. So it was really incredible to see. And you'll notice that everything looks a little burned. There was a prescribed fire in the area at a couple months before we went out there in January. So it's not a time of a lot of growth. The you know, all the burn is still pretty evident. In the middle picture, you see it's essentially refuse of daily life. There are bottles. You can see kind of a square case bottle. These were usually for gin and other spirits, but things like bricks. On the right, you have a whiteware ceramic, so things that you would have used to eat off of. And this is essentially discard from the people that were living out there. But as archaeologists, we can learn a lot about people's daily lives based on the things that they're throwing away. They might not be able to use them anymore, but we can understand what they had access to, potential socioeconomic status, cultural affiliation, based on these kinds of artifacts that we're seeing on these sites and documenting. So we can go to the next slide whenever you have a chance. One of the issues and one of the things that we're contending with as part of this project is change over time. And when we talk about natural impacts to archaeological sites and cultural heritage sites, one of the things that we talk about in our coastal areas is erosion. And that erosion can happen because of things like sea level rise, but it can also happen during major storm events. And if you're familiar with, you know, life in Florida, major storm events are just a part of that. It's something we deal with every year. And some years we get lucky and they go to other parts of Florida, but I think anyone living in coastal Florida knows it's just a matter of time before a major storm comes your way again. And so on the island, when we were working out there, we do see erosion happening. And the fact that you're seeing, you know, we have kind of the beach area here, but all of these roots that are coming out, there's a giant root mat that's just kind of getting eaten away by the waves and the tides there. So this is kind of where we're going when we're monitoring these sites, the kinds of impacts that we're looking for in terms of recording. So we can go to the next slide whenever you have a chance, Anita. So we returned to Little St. George Island the next day. This time we had the help of some of staff from the reserve. Becca had joined us, and they very kindly donated the use of their UTVs so that we could get to some of the more farther flung sites at the on the island. So here we are riding around in our UTV. We can go to the next slide, Anita. Some of the sites that we monitored, and I won't spend too much time on them, but include things like this site. And this gives you an idea of kind of the range of things that we're seeing. This is a solitary grave marker on Little St. George Island, right? And if we go to the next slide, you'll see some detail up on that marker. It's a beautifully done marble marker with information about the person who is commemorated here, Lewis Leland. Passed away in 1841. And again, if you're familiar with local history, you know that this period of time in kind of the mid 19th century, coastal Florida was plagued with yellow fever. And so we see a lot of deaths related to yellow fever. And based on information we've been able to find historically and in the census, what we believe is that Lewis Leland, this individual, was serving on a ship that was anchored not far off of the island in quarantine because of the presence of yellow fever. And unfortunately, he passed away to yellow fever, from yellow fever. And the stone was placed here on land, not far from where he died, as a way to commemorate him. So we don't believe that a body is actually buried there. It may have been buried at sea, but this again is more of a stone to commemorate him. We can go to the next slide. Other locations on Little St. George Island that we looked at included the Marshall Fieldhouse, and this is a publicly interpreted site. So again, a lot of these docks out on Little St. George Island are publicly accessible. People can go out there and recreate and enjoy the beach. The Marshall Fieldhouse is one of these places. It's not unlocked so that you can get inside as a public person visiting the site, but there are a number of really fantastic interpretive sites around the area. So because it is of some age and represents a homesteading period from the 19th and 20th centuries on the island, predominantly the 20th century, we wanted to include it in our project because, again, if we have a major storm event come through, here is a historical resource that could potentially be impacted by those weather events. So if we go to the next couple of slides, you can just kind of click through them. You have some photos of the inside of the Marshall House. Again, it's a historic property, served a family that was living on the island for some time. And that was the inside of it there. Other sites we observed included shell midden sites. We don't believe that these were places where people were living in the woodland or Mississippian periods. They're probably places where they were harvesting shellfish for food. So kind of like campsites on the barrier islands. Barrier islands are not great places to live. But they do have a lot of resources, in particular Little St. George Island. So other sites we monitored included that, but what you can see here, again, from a different perspective, is the erosion that we're talking about. It doesn't look quite as bad here, but the fact that we have things like cabbage palms and this kind of other low-lying vegetation, not just grasses, right near the water's edge like that, indicates to us that there is absolutely some erosion happening here over time. And so these sites are kind of slowly getting eaten away. We can go to the next slide, Anita. Here's another really good example of erosion, of course, with some plastic trash can refuse in the foreground there that probably washed up from a storm. But you can see there is a kind of a significant escarpment where that land and the root mat is being eaten away by the water. And this is not on the Gulf side of Little St. George Island. This photo was taken on the bay side of Little St. George Island. So erosion is happening in both places. We can go to the next slide. One of the other significant sites that we're monitoring on Little St. George Island, and again, if you're familiar with local history, you're probably familiar with this one, but the St. George Island Lighthouse that was out there, which fell in 2005 due to slow erosion of the landmass on the island. And so one of the things that we're monitoring as part of that is not only the foundations of the lighthouse, which are now in the water, and those are actually on the next slide if we want to move to that. So you can see them right there. So this, again, was once on land, now in the water. And this is not just a tidal change. This is pretty significantly in the water at this point. But if we want to go to the next slide, there were also a number of outbuildings, including a lighthouse keeper's quarter associated with this site. And all of those are historic sites or historic properties and part of this larger archaeological site now. So we see things like these kind of intact brick piers, which probably would have held up some of those outbuildings, or the lighthouse keeper's house. We can go to the next slide. We also see some material culture related to these buildings. Some of the buildings are older than others. What you can see here is kind of the remains of a corrugated roofing that probably would have been on one of these outbuildings. Probably not the house itself, but probably on one of the outbuildings. We can go to the next slide. And I'm not delving too much into the history of the sites because I could keep you talking or listening for hours if I did that, but this is mostly just to give you an idea of what we're seeing on the ground. So in terms of material culture, we see things like, simple things like architectural remains. So this is a square nail that was found at the site, or a machine nail. You can see in the corner there's a little bit of aqua glass, and this would have been, something that we would typically relate to late 1800s, early 1900s sites. We can go to the next slide. And then I just wanted to throw in, not only were we doing field work during the day, but we would turn around, and then at night we held, during this week that we were there in January, one of our community conversations. And so this particular one that we held in January was at the Holy Family Senior Center in Apalachicola. You can see in this photo Anita, who is our fantastic partner with the reserve, myself in the middle, and then Bria Brooks, our graduate student assistant, on the right. And we can go through the next photos. We got a group of people together to talk about cultural heritage in Apalachicola, what it means to them, their concerns that they have about what is happening in their community, if they have any concerns or things that they want to see going forward. This is how we're collecting really good information about how the community is engaged with this heritage. We can go to the next photo. And so obviously we're not tying any of the information from those meetings to a single person, but I thought it would be important to highlight kind of the feedback that we're getting. So you can tell that people feel very strongly about how connected the Apalachicola area is to its heritage. There's a feeling of past and present in this one place. We can go to the next one. We can see, and this came out a lot, how the working shoreline, how labor tied to seafood is incredibly important to the identity of the community in Apalachicola. And there's a lot of concern about whether or not it's going to be able to retain that going forward as industries potentially change, as development happens. We can go to the next slide. Again, here, same thing, more concern about how that heritage is going to be preserved. And then also about how we're telling the stories that we're telling in terms of other people living in this area. It's not just about seafood or lumber. It's also about the pre-contact people, the indigenous cultures that are also a part of this area. How are we telling these stories, and how are we letting people know the depth of time that is really represented within the reserve? So we can go forward. So we visited other sites further upriver, and I just wanted to highlight one of them real quick, and we can move to the next slide. So we're kind of moving up away from the coast here to a site called Prospect Bluff, historic sites. And this is a site that's managed by the U.S. National Forests, or the U.S. Forest Service, as part of the Apalachicola National Forest. And this is a site of a series of forts, but one of the earliest of which on this location was related to the British Marines in the early 19th, in the early 19th century, during kind of the conflict with the British conflict with the Spanish, but then also you have the Americans who are starting to move in to Florida and kind of make themselves known. The Prospect Bluff site, also referred to as the Negro Fort by some, was set up essentially as a way for freedom seekers from enslavement coming from the northern American territories or colonies, or states at that time too, a way for these people to find reprieve in Spanish Florida, and in Spanish Florida under the care of British Marines who promised them their freedom if they would provide service to the British military. So not only people who were seeking freedom from enslavement, but also people of various tribal cultures who are moving down, who are being pushed out of their homelands by the American government's kind of march south. And this is kind of the, you know, they're being pushed out of their ancestral lands was part of that removal policy that accumulated or kind of, you know, capstone in the 1830s with the removal policy of most of the tribal members to areas west of the Mississippi River. So Prospect Bluff is significant in that it represents the remains of this site, and also the massacre of the people living at this site by the Americans under the leadership of Andrew Jackson. So if we just go forward, this again is the project or the site that is being studied by Bria for her master's thesis research. She's looking at potential resources in the offshore areas in the Apalachicola River. So she did some marine survey in that area. She hasn't finished her thesis yet, so we'll have to wait for more results on how she's analyzed her data. But the site is incredibly significant. And if we go forward, some of the issues that we're dealing with at this site, as opposed to our barrier island areas where we're seeing kind of erosional change and natural impact, have to do with cultural impact. And so we've been working with the land manager with the Apalachicola National Forest, and in talking with her and the people that she works with or manages at the site, we know that people are regularly going out and digging up spots around Prospect Bluff historic sites. And this is problematic on several levels, not only because we don't want to disturb archaeological sites in an unsystematic manner, but this is also a sacred space for the people that died there. And no archaeology, no disturbance archaeology happens at this site anymore. And so when people dig it up, it's kind of an issue in two different kinds of ways. So unfortunately, each time we've been out there, we've seen evidence of disturbance and have reported that to the local land manager, which would have been the Forest Service. So you can see here, and if we go to the next slide too, evidence of people digging at the site. Probably what they're doing is metal detecting and looking for mini balls related to the later Civil War or any kind of potential buttons, things like that is usually what people are looking for. But it does create a significant disturbance to the site. And huge ethical issue as well. And if we go forward, if you're interested in the site of Prospect Bluff and you want to learn a little bit more about it, I just wanted to put a plug in here for the North Florida African American Corridor Project and the 20th of May group. They're doing an event on Saturday, May 25th, so just a couple of days away, from 10 o'clock until I think almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I can provide a link to that. I think I've got. And Anita, you have to make sure this gets through, but I've got a link to their Facebook event where you can learn more about what's going on that day. And if that doesn't come through to everybody, Anita, if you don't mind sending that on as part of a chat to everybody, the link to that site. So something to consider if you're looking for something to do this weekend. And if we go forward, I know I've got just a couple of minutes left. Other sites include this site, which is actually the first recorded site in Franklin County by a professional archaeologist. And this is a site, this is a shell mound and midden, probably related to not just a harvesting or a campsite, but more of a settlement site for people based on how massive it is. And you can see, I know it's difficult to tease out in the photos, but you can tell by the shadows and the trees how big of an area we're talking about in terms of topography. And we can go to the next slide, Anita. A lot of what we see on the ground, of course, is just shell. And one of the reasons for that, if we go to the next slide, is that the site has been, since its discovery, its early discovery in the early 1900s, has been massively dug out. Not only by early archaeologists who don't use the kinds of scientific methods that we use today, but I think also by people living in the area who wanted to do their own excavation and recovery of artifacts. And so we see these kind of massive trenches dug through the site where people were doing uncontrolled digging. And that's what you're seeing in these photos here. So a lot of what was there has been lost or removed or completely disturbed at this site. So if we go forward one, we are seeing on the ground natural and cultural impacts to a lot of these sites. And I hope that this gave you a good idea or a sense of what it's like to do the work that we're doing out there. There's more to be done. We're still seeking community input. Even though we've done our community conversations, we have that online survey available. And so if if you have your cell phone nearby, you live in the Apalachicola area, you have an investment in this heritage, I would love to hear from you. And I would love for you to participate in the survey that we have going on. So there's a QR code to that survey there. And if we go to the next slide, I also wanted to put in here a way for you to reach out. So if you want to get in touch with me, if you want to see the project page, you can just go to fpan.us/POTA or People of the Apalachicola. You can follow the QR code there as well. But if you have ideas, concerns, questions, are interested in the outcomes of the research, I would love to hear from you. And you can get in touch with me this way. And I think with 5 minutes to spare, Anita.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Do we have any questions? You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. Give you a few minutes. I put the link in the chat to the Facebook site.
Thank you. And maybe I'll put the link to the project page here too, if you would like to share that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot I didn't talk about. I know some people are more interested in the history, some people are more interested in the archaeology, and I didn't do either a lot of justice in this presentation because I wanted to give an idea of what we're doing. So there's more to come and there's more information out there, and what is being produced out of this project will be publicly accessible, not in terms of locational information of archaeological sites, but in terms of the data that we collect. So you can expect, if you're following the Reserve on Facebook, if you're following FPAN or the University of West Florida on social media or following the project page, you can bet that you'll see the outcomes of this as well in those places.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any questions. I know we had a couple of them earlier. I had the good fortune of visiting a local site with the team, and it is amazing what they can see with their trained eyes. And I know she did mention earlier that we've got several sites around here that haven't been visited since the 40s. So this is definitely going to help us update the cultural record for the whole state. We're really appreciative to all of you, and all what you and Mike and Bria bring to the table are all different, and we've definitely enjoyed meeting with you and the public on these issues. I'm not seeing any questions, but feel free. You have Nicole's email there. We are recording this session, and I'll post that to our website, and you can listen to it again. Nicole, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I look forward to your next visit. And we're so excited here at the Reserve to get a better, a more updated view of our cultural resources here. We hope our partnership with you and University of West Florida continues well into the future. I'm looking forward to hearing Bria's work from her dissertation. So just a quick note, our next Sci-Cafe is going to be June 27th. And that'll be up on our website soon, and you can register for that. It will be the Riparian County Stakeholder Coalition. This is a coalition run in the state of Florida, and it's all the stakeholders up and down the river system, the Apalachicola River system proper. And the gentleman who is the staff for that group will be talking about the group, and then also about some fish passage issues with the Woodruff Dam. So please join us in a month for that. And again, Nicole, thank you so much for doing a Sci-Cafe.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And thank you everybody for coming and listening.
Yes, thank you all.
Okay. And Nicole, I will talk to you in the future here. Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, no, I really appreciate you inviting me to come speak, and it was great talking with everybody, and good chance to get to see you again. And we're looking forward to coming back next month in June. I can't believe it's almost June already.
I know. I
I
know.
can't.
Well,
Well,
thank you so much.
Yes. If you need anything, please feel free to reach out.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.